Hello everyone and welcome to this new video in which we are talking about Viking Age shields, because a lot of these Viking Age shields would actually be surprisingly thin. So thin in fact that they could rather easily break, bend, be cut apart or even be destroyed during combat. And yet the so-called Vikings did not really see this as a big problem. In fact, the fact that the Viking Age shields were so fragile could be seen as a strength of the shield. So how is that? Well, let's find out. Now obviously having a thicker shield will, generally speaking, make for a more durable shield, because simply you have more material on the shield, so it is going to be more durable. However, you do also have certain problems with having a thicker shield, like for example the fact that obviously if you have more material, the shield is going to be heavier, which can be a problem for several different things. First of all, you have the fact that it is going to be more tiring to carry the shield with you when traveling, whether that is by foot or by ship or anything like that. It is going to be heavier and therefore it's going to be more impractical. On top of that, you have the problem that it is going to be more tiring to fight with a heavier shield, because you have to move more weight and you are going to be able to move that shield slower. A lighter shield you can move faster than a heavier one, obviously. And this obviously matters for any shield there is, or it is going to apply for every shield there is. However, it is actually especially important for the Viking Age shields, because you would actually fight very actively with these shields. You would not just stand there defending yourself only, you would actually move the shield around a lot and use your shield. You could use it offensively. First of all, you could do shield bashes and stuff like that with it, but you would also move it with your weapon when fighting to protect your hand. So if I am attacking with my weapon's hand, I am not simply going to attack like this. I am actually going to bring my shield with the attack, so I'm actually going to attack like this. That way I can protect my hand and my entire arm with the shield while attacking, and that can be done in different ways. I can attack like this, I can attack like this, I can do all sorts of different attacks while protecting my hand with the shield. And therefore having a lighter shield, you could call it a very light shield, like kind of exaggeratedly light, can be very useful for such a shield when you are using it actively, because otherwise it will be too slow and too tiring to use. Now obviously these Viking shields are going to vary a lot in dimensions and in the way of constructing them, but generally speaking you are going to be talking about a shield that is 80 centimeters in diameter, which is the case for this exact one. 80 centimeters in diameter roughly overall. You obviously do have certain exceptions, like it was rather common to have a slightly larger and slightly smaller shield, but generally speaking around 80 centimeters shield. And it would be constructed with wooden boards basically, which usually would be made out of linden wood, which is a relatively light wood, even though it could also sometimes be made out of pine or any other light wood. But generally speaking, you're going to be talking about lighter wood, not something like oak or something like that, even though that might exist. But generally speaking, slightly lighter woods. Other than that, what you're going to have is a central grip on the shield. So you're basically going to have this piece of wood running all the way along the center. You have slightly different ways of doing it. Like for example, if I grab another shield, like for example this shield right here, it does not have a handle running all the way across the shield. It actually only has one handle in the middle. So you can have all sorts of different ways of constructing the shield, but generally speaking the most common would be to have that handle running all the way across the shield. So you would generally speaking just have this handle running along the center of the shield. On this particular shield I also have this strap here, but that's just for hanging it on the back. And on the front you would have an iron boss, so this right here, which essentially just is a sort of extensions out on the side here, just to create a space for your hand to hold in onto. Generally speaking, this shield would also be covered in something on the exterior of the shield, underneath the paint, over the wood underneath the paint, which could be a form of textile, but generally speaking it's going to be something like leather. And finally you're going to have an edging that is usually going to be made out of rawhide, even though you could also theoretically use other things too. Now, in terms of the thickness, the Viking shield were not just simply thin shields. They were actually starting out around the boss in the middle. They were relatively thick, so around 8 millimeters on average, which still is relatively thin, but thicker than on the edges of the shield. It would actually start thick and then thin down towards the edges of the shield, at least generally speaking. And towards the edges of the shield, you would generally speaking be talking about in between 3 and 4 millimeters thickness on the edge of the shield. And this was done because obviously in the middle of the shield you need it to be relatively thick to have a relative amount of strength, because that is the center of the shield, that is where you're attaching the boss and everything like that. However, having too thick of edges on the shield has the problem that it is further away from your hand, and therefore when you are turning the shield around, you're moving around, stuff like that, having a lot of weight on the exterior can create a lot more momentum and feel much more heavy because you have a lot of weight on the exterior. That way, by thinning it down towards the edges, you would concentrate the weight more in the middle, therefore the shield would feel lighter than it actually was. Particularly when you are rotating the shield, it would essentially just reduce the rotational weight on the shield itself. Now obviously all of this means that the shields would end up being relatively fragile because they were not very thick, and particularly the edges were actually very thin. And we know for a fact that these shields were not very strong. We have all sorts of different evidences showing that these shields were not very strong. Partially experimental archaeology, simply people reconstructing these shields as they were made historically and finding out that these shields are not very durable. And also we do have certain historical sources, like for example if we take the sagas, and obviously the sagas are not to be trusted entirely, they are fiction stories, but to a certain degree you can draw certain things out of them. So for example, if I take just a certain section from Gisla Saga Sur Sonar, which is one of the sagas, it says, "So Björn made a blow at Gisli, but Gisli threw his shield before him, and the sword hewed off from the shield all that it smote from below the handle. Then Gisli smote at Björn in his turn, and the stroke fell on the tail of the shield and shore it right off, and then passed on and struck off his leg below the knee. One other stroke he dealt him and took off his head." So we can see here a relatively short exchange between two different people, yet both of the shields get broken in this very, very short fight. So clearly the shields were not very durable, and obviously this is a saga, we cannot take it literally what is written right here, but it does show to a certain degree that the shields were not expected to survive a fight very, very long. They were actually expected to be broken during the fight, and that was considered relatively normal. And we can also see that very clearly, the fact that they were expected to break during combat. It wasn't just like, oh no, my shield broke, that is unfortunate. The shield was actually expected to break during combat, because if we look at the rules of Holmgang, so essentially a duel, what you're going to find is that each fighter was allowed to have 3 shields with him. So if I just read the rules right here, these are from Kormork's saga. It says, "Each man should have 3 shields, and when they were cut up he must get upon the hide if he had given way from it before, and guard himself with his weapon alone thereafter." So, as you can see, they were allowed to have 3 shields. Each opponent was allowed to have 3 shields, and these shields were expected to get broken during the fight. He was expected to need to change shield during the fight, and if he broke all of his shield, which did actually happen sometimes, then he had to fight without a shield. But 3 shields could get broken relatively easily in one single fight for each fighter, so meaning that clearly the shield was basically just a disposable item that would just get broken very, very quickly. And if I illustrate with again one example, which is from a Holmgang within a duel, which again is from Kormork's saga, it says, "Thord carried the shield before Bersi, and Voli was Torkel's shield bearer. When 2 shields had been hacked to splinters, Bersi bade Torkel take the third. But he would not. Bersi still had a shield and a sword that was long and sharp." So, from a duel, one of the 2 opponents already has broken 2 of his shields, but does not want to take the third. But again, just an example of the fact that these shields were actually not durable and they would break very often. Again, these are examples from sagas, which cannot be taken literally, but still, when we're talking about Holmgang, we can be relatively sure that since they had rules around this, on the shields, that they were clearly expecting to be durable because they were allowed to have 3, we can draw a certain amount of evidence from that, and we can say it is relatively true that these shields were not very durable. And on top of that, I just want to add also that we do have experimental archaeological tests on these shields, on historical accurate replicas of these shields, showing that they are not durable whatsoever. Now obviously this does not mean that these Viking shields were useless at all, because the thing is that you do not need to have a shield that is indestructible indestructible for it to actually be useful. If I am using a shield and I get hit by a sword, and the sword cuts deeply into the shield and has destroyed my shield, the thing is that it has still stopped the sword, so it has still done its job. You could compare it to the airbag in a car. We have airbags in cars, yet they can only be used once. Like if you get an accident, the airbag is going to deploy, it's going to do its job, but it can only do it once, then you need to replace it. And the same goes for a Viking shield. Like, it is going to help you in one fight, but then you actually have to replace it. And that is just how it is. And a shield that would be durable enough to not have to be replaced would have the problem that if it is so durable, then it is much heavier, and therefore it will actually be less effective in the fight itself, even though it is more durable. And another important point is that if you have a very thick shield and you get hit by, let's say, for example, a sword, you get a sword strike hitting your shield. If your shield is very, very thick, the sword is not going to be able to cut deeply into the shield because the shield is so thick. So yes, you will have prevented the sword from hitting you. However, if the shield is thin, you can actually have an advantage with the fact that it cuts deeply into the shield, because if it cuts deeply into the shield, it is going to get stuck inside the shield. If it is durable, if the shield is thick, it is just going to bounce away. If it is thin, then the sword is actually going to cut into the shield and get stuck. And this can actually be very, very useful. And this might also have been another reason why they actually had their shields thinned down towards the edges. It might have been because they purposefully wanted the opponent's weapon to get stuck in their shields by having the edges of the shield so thin. Yet having the center of the shield relatively thick, so it could not pierce all the way into the boss and actually hurting you. There might be a chance, we do not know, but it could be a secondary reason to having such thin edges on the shield. Because the thing is that we know from experimental archaeology partly that that weapons can get stuck in the shield, and also we know that people historically use this to their advantage. For example, again, we have certain mentions from the sagas of this. Now, again, the sagas cannot be fully trusted, but to a certain degree, it can give us an indication of how people thought of these different fighting techniques. If we go to Brenne Njol's saga, also just called Njol's saga, we have this. Sigmund drew his sword and cut at Skarphedin, and the sword cuts into his shield so that it stuck fast. Skarphedin gave the shield such a quick twist that Sigmund let go his sword. Then Skarphedin hews at Sigmund with his axe. So, as you can see, we have one person called Skarphedin that has a shield. The other person comes in and hits his shield with a sword. The sword cuts into the shield, gets stuck, and then he just gives it a twist so that he just lets go of his sword and is then disarmed. And we have another example of something similar happening in the same saga, which says, Kari had his shield before him, and the blow fell on it, and the spear stuck fast in the shield. Then Kari twisted the shield so smartly that the spear snapped short off, and then he drew his sword and smote at Mudolf. So here again we have an example of a weapon, in this case a spear, getting stuck in the shield, and therefore he can just give a twist to the shield and apparently break the spear. Obviously, these are examples from the sagas, we cannot take them literally, but it does give us an idea of how people thought about the shield. And essentially what they show us is that basically the Viking shield, since it was so thin, could work similarly to something like a sword breaker. The sword breaker essentially being a sort of dagger with kind of notches at the back that can be used to trap the blade of your opponent. So if he gets his blade inside one of those notches, you can then twist your dagger and you can then control his sword quite easily. And the Viking shield works in a similar manner, because if you get a blow hitting the shield, it is going to get stuck in the shield, at least has a higher chance of getting stuck in the shield, and therefore you can use that to, in the case of the spear, he used it to break the spear, and in the case of the sword, in the previous example, he just disarmed his opponent by twisting the shield. And to a certain degree, even if you don't disarm your opponent or break his weapon, you can also just control his weapon more easily, because if you just get his sword stuck in your shield, well, it's going to be hard for him to get it out, and therefore even if you don't twist it or anything like that or disarm him, you can still just attack him without him having a weapon to counterattack with. So the thing is that that was actually something really useful with the Viking shield, and it was only allowed by the fact that the Viking shield was so thin. On top of that, there was something else that's important to mention, that is against missile weapon. Let's say you're getting shot at with a bow, for example, you're getting a spear thrown at you, something like that, or you are on a battlefield in a shield wall, you have a shield wall formation, you obviously need your shield to cover as much of an area as possible. And the thing is that by having a thinner shield, you can actually have the shield cover a much larger surface for the same weight. Because yes, obviously you could just take all this material, compress it into one smaller shield that would weigh the same, that would be just as nimble and so on. However, you have the problem that it would not cover such a large area, which can be a problem in melee combat, because if the shield weighs the same and I have it all the way down here, I'm getting a blow from over here, I need to move this relatively large shield only up there. However, a smaller shield, I would need to move all the way up there to actually be able to defend myself properly. So you have that. A larger shield is generally speaking better in melee for the same weight. And also against missile weapon in a shield wall or that, it is better to have a larger shield. Now yes, something like a bow, something like can pierce the shield and potentially pierce relatively far through the shield, particularly if it hits towards the edges, but you have a boss grip shield, so you can hold it quite far out, so it isn't too much of a problem. It would be much more of a problem if the shield was a strapped shield, so you would hold it with your arm like this. You cannot hold it so far away from you, and you have your arm stuck all the way up to the shield. But basically, there is also that compromise to talk about, which is the fact that it can, at least in certain cases, be useful to have a larger shield for the same weight by having it thinner. Now, obviously, all of this being said, the fact that the Viking shield was so thin was still a disadvantage in a lot of contexts. Like, for example, well, first of all, you need to replace or at least repair your shield way more often, which can be a problem particularly on long campaigns. Like, for example, if you have a long campaign and you have to fight several battles, for example, you have the problem that your shield might be broken in the first battle, and then after that, you don't really have a shield to use. Now, yes, you could loot your opponents from shields, but they might also have broken their shield. So you do have that problem that since it is a more disposable item, you might end up with a completely broken shield that is going to have a very reduced effectiveness. On top of that, you have the problem that if you get a sword cutting into your shield, you can have the problem that if you were too close to the edge of the shield, for example, if I'm standing like here, if I have a very, very durable shield, that might be enough. I might be protected because the shield is durable enough. However, if the sword of the opponent cuts into the shield, I have the problem that my shoulder is right behind, and my opponent's sword can actually cut into my shoulder, even though I was protecting myself good enough, because I was actually protecting myself with the shield. Because the shield was thin, that can be a problem. And actually, if we go back to one of the examples I used, the one from Gisla Sursonar's saga, we have, then Gisli smote at Bjorn in his turn, and the stroke fell on the tail of the shield and shore it right off, and then passed on and struck off his leg below the knee. One other stroke he dealt him and took off his head. But there you can see he chops at the shield, but since he can cut through the shield, he then cuts off the leg of his opponent, because the shield wasn't strong enough to actually be able to resist that blow, so he cut through and cut off his leg. Obviously, this is taken from a saga, so it's probably exaggerated, but to a certain degree, these things could happen. And so you have the problem that potentially the defense of the shield might get pierced by certain weapons. In this case, it is a sword, but particularly certain weapons like, for example, a Dane axe, like, for example, stronger bows, something like that, those can actually be a potential problem. So having a thinner shield is definitely not perfect in all situations, but it can offer certain advantages, and for the Vikings themselves, and well, the so-called Vikings, for all the Scandinavians, for most people from the Viking Age, this seemed to have been worth it. But anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.